Hello guys, welcome to Cloud Tech. So in today's video, we are going to design REST API application using Spring Boot. We have been getting a lot of requests from our student that they want end-to-end REST API application using Spring Boot, where we communicate with the database. We came up with this use case where we are going to add an order to the database, get an order, update an order, and delete an order using a REST API. So let's understand the architecture of our Spring Boot application. The first thing that we are going to have is controller, then we are going to have service, then repository, and repository is going to talk to our PostgreSQL database. So let's try to get to our Spring Boot creation part. First thing we have to do is create a Spring Boot application. For that, we have to go to Spring Initializer. So Spring Initializer is a website that helps you to create a Spring Boot application. Now we have to select some of the properties. For example, the project type. For example, we have to create a Maven project. So we are going to select Maven. And the language we are going to opt for is Java. The Spring Boot version is 3.1.4. And then we have to specify group name, artifact name, description. This can be according to your project use case. For example, we are using order management. We are designing order management system, and hence the name is order management. Then we have to include the dependencies. We are going to include Spring Web for designing the REST API, Spring Data JPA for communicating with the database, and then PostgreSQL driver, as our database is PostgreSQL. Once you do all this, you have to generate your project. So I generated my project and it got downloaded into my downloads folder. So it is going to be a zip. You have to unzip it and then you have to import it into the Eclipse. So let's try to unzip and import that project to my Eclipse. I'm going to go to my Eclipse and I'm going to import a project. So in my case, it is going to be existing Maven project. So just select existing Maven project and next. Now here you have to specify the directory where your project resides. So in my case, the directory is Spring Boot Order Management. I'm going to specify this and then you're going to see form.xml. Now you have to click on finish. So this will take a while to download dependencies to set up your project in Eclipse, depending upon your internet speed. Now you should get a structure like this in your Eclipse package explorer. So you have something called as order management application. There is only one class present in your source folder. And one important thing is application.properties. So there are no properties yet. Now the next step that we have to do is we have to use this application and connect to the database. For connecting to the database, we have to specify some of the database properties. So let's try to see what are the properties. Before that, I'll show you my PostgreSQL setup. So this is my PostgreSQL, and I have created one order management database and schema. If you try to look at the schema under the tables, I'm going to refresh it, and there are no tables as of now. It is empty schema. Now let's try to see what are the properties. So if I go to the properties, in the connection, you will see this database is running on my local machine. So the host name is localhost, port is 5432, username is PostgreS, and password in my case is admin. So we have to configure all these properties in our application.properties file. So let's try to go ahead and use the application properties file. So I'm going to copy. I have that application.properties file handy with me. I'm going to explain you each part of it. So let's try to see. And there is something called as DDL auto. So this is kept to update, where if I make any changes to my class, so that changes will be reflected into my table structure. Now we have a URL. So here you have to mention the database URL. So we just saw our database is running on localhost and the port is 5432 and the database name is order management. So you have to be aware about your database name. You have to specify the right database name. Then username, you have to specify the username, PostgreS, and the password of your database, which is admin in my case. And you have to mention the driver class, which depends upon the database. So if your database is PostgreSQL, it is going to be org or PostgreSQL.driver. If it is MySQL, it is going to be something else. You have to see the documentation to get the class name. Now, once we did configure application properties, let's try to go to order management system and let's try to run and see if this works. So I just started my Spring Boot application and if it is able to make the connection successfully with the database. It is just starting out. Let's try to wait. Okay. All right, it started out and I see there is no error in my console. So the database connection is successful. Now we can move further and try to add various layers to it. So generally, while designing any Spring Boot application, you first start with the domain entity. So domain is what? Domain is an entity that we want to save to the database and we want to perform some operation on it. Let's try to create an entity, and we create an entity in a package known as model. So let's try to create a new package dot model. In model, you keep all the models. So model in our case is order. So I'm going to create a new class and I'm going to call this as order. So our order will have various parameters. So what are the different parameters that we have? We want three things. We want an identifier, we want customer name, and we want to save the amount. So let's try to create that. So private integer ID, that is going to be my first thing. This is going to be identifier for my order. Private customer name, so string customer name. This is going to be my second thing that I want to save in database, and then private double amount. So what is the amount of this order? So I want to save these three things to the database. Once I do this, I'm going to create getters and setters for this. Let me go to source, generate getters and setters. I'm going to select all three, and then I'm going to generate. So this will give me all the getters and setters. All right. So while designing any database entity in your Spring Boot application, the first thing that you have to give is entity. So this is the annotation that you have to use. Entity from Jakarta persistent entity, right? So it accepts one attribute known as name. So this is going to be the name of your table in the database. I'm going to give the name as order info. I gave this name. Once you define the entity, the next thing is to define a primary key. So to define a primary key, there is something called as generated value and ID. So there are two annotations. I'm going to annotate this with ID from Jakarta persistent, and I am also going to use generated value. So generated value at the bottom, and then you have to give the strategy. By what strategy you have to create the attribute. So let's give a strategy and generate type, generation type dot auto. So this will help us in creating new primary key value every time we try to save attribute or save order to the database. Our Pojo is ready. Now the next step is to create a repository. So we have completed the first part. Now we are here. So we'll create a repository. And the repository in our case is going to be a CRUD repository. So creating repository is very simple in the Spring Boot application. We just have to extend from a class. So let's try to create a new package. New package, and I'm going to name this as repository. This is going to be my repository package, and the repository is always an interface. So let's try to create a new interface, and you have to name this as order repository. You can name this anything, but I am naming this as order repository. Once you create this, you have to extend this with something called as CRUD repository. Extends from CRUD repository. All right, so it needs two generic type. The first one is the type of entity that you want to save to the database. So in our case, what is the type? It is order. All right, and the second is the type of identifier that you want to save. What is the type of identifier? So in our case, we want integer because the type of ID is integer. Let's go ahead and see. If I see the type of ID is what? Integer, then I will specify integer here. Now my CRUD repository is ready. So if you see the architecture, the repository part is done. The next part is the service part. So let's try to get to the service part. I'll create one more package and I'll name this, let me create a package and dot service. This will hold all my services in the application. So for creating any service, the first thing that you have to do is create one interface and then create one class. So let's try to create one interface first. Interface, and I'm going to name this interface as I order service. So always prefix your interfaces with I order service. So this will have all the methods that I want my service to implement. I order service. All right, so interface is created. Now I'm going to create a class. Let's try to create a class, and I'm going to name this as order service. This will implement my interface. Let's implement that interface. Implements I order service. It's very simple. You have to create one interface, you have to create one class, and you have to implement that interface with that class. You got it, you got the setup for service ready. Now the next step is, the first thing that we are going to do is create an order and save it to the database. For that thing, let's try to create a controller. So I'm going to create a controller. Before creating controller, your service is always annotated with an annotation. So I'm going to annotate your service with something called as @service. So let's try to annotate this with @service annotation. @service. We have annotated this class. Let's now move to the controller part, which is where the request comes from the client. So let's try to create controller. So I'm going to create a package and I'm going to create this controller. The package is created. Now let's try to create order controller. You can name this anything, but try to keep name associated with the entity that you are working with. So class, and this is going to be my order controller. So we just created a controller. Now there are two annotations to mark anything as controller. The first thing that you have to do is annotate this with REST controller. Okay, and the second thing is you have to annotate this with request mapping. So I have annotated my controller with REST controller and request mapping. Now I have to specify the base of this controller. So for specifying the base of any controller, you have to add the path to it. So path is going to be my orders. All right. So my controller is ready. So we have, what we have done so far, we have designed a repository, we have designed a service, we have designed a controller, but we haven't injected repository into service and service into controller. So let's try to go ahead and try to inject them. So first thing we are going to do is in my service, I'm going to inject the repository. Private order repository, and I'm going to name this as order repository, and I'm going to auto wire this. So let's try to auto wire. Auto wire is an annotation which we use for auto wiring. Now I'm going to create getters and setters, the source, generate getters and setters, order repository, and you have your repository injected into your service. Similarly, we have to inject order service into our controller. So let's try to go to controller and try to inject order service. So private I order service, and I'm going to name this as order service. All right. Now to inject this, we are going to use something called as auto wired. Auto wired is the annotation, and similarly we have to give getters and setters. Source, generate getters and setters, and order service. So you have created order service. Now if you look at the setup, we created this repository, injected into service, we created service, injected into controller, and we have the controller. Now whenever client makes a request, the request comes to the controller, then it goes to the service, then it goes to the repository, and only repository is allowed to talk to the database. Let's now implement our first request, which is adding order to our database. So let's try to go to the controller and try to implement the first part, which is adding something to the database. Now, as we know, to add something, we have to use post mapping, because post is something which we use to create a resource. So let's try to write a method. So the method that I'm going to write is public. This is going to return an order, and I'm going to name this as add order. And this is going to accept all the values that order needs. So let me import the order first. All right. So we have something called as request body. So we need to use this annotation for accepting values from the user. Now we use order, and we name this as order. So it accepts an order which we want to save to the database, and it returns the saved order from the database back to the user. Let's try to create this method. And for now, as it is giving error, so I'm going to return null from here. All right. Finally, we are going to write the logic, but for now, we are going to return null. Now, what we have to do? So the first thing that we have to do is use order service to save this order to the database. But we don't have any method defined in order service. So let's try to add the method. What method we are going to write? Public order add order is going to be my method. So this is the method that my service will implement. So public order add order. What it accepts the order that you want to save to the database. So that is something that we want. Now this is an interface that our order service is implementing. So we have to implement this unimplemented method. So let's try to implement this. Okay. We have our add order added here. Now, once we get this, what we are going to do, we are going to take order repository, and we are going to call the save method and pass the order that we want to save. All right. And once you save this, the save method returns back the order. So I'm going to take it into a reference known as saved order. All right. We saved an order and we got the reference back, and I'm going to return this to my so this is service to my controller. All right, so we wrote the flow for adding an order. Let's go to the controller and call this method. So I take order service, and I do add order, and I pass the order back. And as I'm getting the reference of the saved order, I'm going to take order saved order equal to this, and then I'm going to pass saved order back from here. This one thing that we have to do is this method we have to add response body. So let's add response body. The response body will return the JSON back to the client. So when we get order, response body will convert that order to JSON format and return it back to the client. This is what we have done. Now this is going to be a post method. So in my case, I'm going to take post mapping. Post mapping is used to specify the post method. Now let's try to see if we are able to save to the database. I'll go to the database. I'll close this, and I'll refresh the schema, and I'll check the table. There is no table yet. No table yet. So I'll start my Spring Boot application. This is my Spring Boot application, run as Java. So it will give any exception if there is any bean not correctly configured. So let's see if we get any exception. If there is any exception, we'll try to resolve that. Okay, so there is no. So order management application, if you see here, it is started at port 8080. I'll go and I'll try to refresh the database. So let's try to refresh the database. Okay, so let's go to table, and our order info table is created. Now what we will do is select this. So there is nothing in the table as we haven't saved anything. Now the next step is to try to call the API that we just wrote for saving the order. So I'm here. So let's go to the post part and let's try to save the order. So I'll make this big. Okay, so the first thing, customer name is Tofik, amount is 500, and orders. Now let me save this and see if it works. Yeah, so it got saved and the ID is 102. 102 is the ID of the entity that we just saved. Now let's try to go to order info, and when I execute this, I see ID as 102, amount as 500, and name as Tofik. So order successfully got saved into my database. Now the next thing that we have to do is we have to get the saved order from the database. So we have to write one API known as get order. Now let's try to write that API. And whenever writing an API, just try to keep in mind, first you have to write something in repository. If it is already there in repository, then you have to write that the equivalent logic in service. And finally, you have to write the logic in controller. So let's try to go to the service part and try to write the logic for get order. So I'm going to go to service part and I'm going to write the logic for getting the order. What should be the logic? It should be a public method, obviously. It should return the order. I'm going to name this as get order. What it should accept? It should accept the ID of the order that we want to return. So what is the ID in our case? The ID is integer ID. So this is going to be the ID of the order, and what it is going to return, it is going to return the order, but for now I'm going to return null as it is giving error. And let's try to override this. So when we try to override, as we haven't added this to our interface, this will give an error. So it will ask us to add the same thing to the interface. So let's try to add this to the interface. Order, get order, and then the ID of the order. Perfect. Now let's move here and save this. All right. Now we have reached up to a state where we are in our service and we want to call our repository and then get the saved order from the database. How should we do that? We have order repository dot. There's something called as find. So for finding, for getting things from database, we use find by ID. Find by ID, and we need to pass the ID. Now, once we call find by ID, this returns optional of order. So optional is something if the order is not present, then optional will contain null. If the order is present, then the actual order will be present in the optional class. We have to create that optional of what type of order, and I'm going to name this as order optional. Okay, so once we get the optional, the final thing that we have to return is order optional dot or else. So if the order is present, then return the order, or else return null. Okay, we wrote the logic to get the order into the server. Now let's try to add the same method to the controller class. This is my controller class, and I'm going to write the same method. So what I'm going to write, public, and we want to return the order. So let's try to return the order from our model class, and then we are going to name the method as get order. So this accepts what? This accepts the ID of your order. Let me write the ID. So integer ID. So what is the type of ID? It is integer. So I'm going to write it. Now let's try to return. So what I'm going to return? So return order service. We just wrote the method. We are going to use the same method, get order, and I'm going to pass the ID. So this will return me the order, and the same order I'm going to return back to the client. For returning the order, we need an annotation, something called as response body. The response body will take the order and will return the JSON of that order. We have this. We have to take the ID from the client. For taking ID, we need something called as path variable. So let's try to annotate that with path variable. All right. So we'll accept this from the URI. So for that reason, we need path variable. Now this is going to be my get method. So I'm going to take get mapping, and as we are getting the ID from the URI, so we have to specify the path. Path is going to be my slash, and then the name of the variable. So ID is the name of the variable. The slash is this slash. All right. Now our get method is ready. So let's try to see if let's try to hit this from Postman and see if it works. I'll go here. I'll check the post method, and the ID that we got is 102. I'll go to the database and I'll check from the order info. Yeah, we got 102. Let me start the server. So the server is stopped. I'll start the server in debug mode, or let the server get started. Okay, while the server is starting, I'll go to my Postman, and this is my get method. So get method accepts one identifier, so it is 102. We just saw in the database. Now let the server get started, which is starting up, and it's taking a while. So now the server is starting. Yeah, so the start is complete. Now what I could do, I could go to my Postman, and I could try to hit the send. So once I send it, you see the connection is refused. I'll send it again, and I got the customer. So earlier the server wasn't started, so the connection was refused. If you see, the ID is 102, the customer name is Tofik, and the amount is 500. So this is the get API. So for get API, we use get mapping. So we saw the post API where we use post to save it, and we saw get API to get the data from the database. Now there are two more operations. One is to update the order, and one is to delete the order. So let's try to look at the third operation, which is updating the order. For example, consider this. I have my order as 102, customer name is Tofik, and the value of amount is 500. Now I have to update the order amount from 500 to 700. So that I can use put to perform this operation, or from 500 to 1000, for example. Then I can use put operation to perform this update. So 102 is the, for this we have to write the API. So let's try to go ahead and stop the server and write the API. So I'll stop the server and write the API. As we saw in our architecture, the method for updating is already present in the repository. We have to write logic in service, and we have to write logic in controller. So let's try to write logic in service first. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to write the logic. For that, I'm going to write a method known as update order, and this update order is going to interact with order repository, and then it is going to update the order in my database. So let's try to go ahead and see how to write this. Let me go to order service. Yeah, and here below get order, I'm going to write the logic for update. Let's try to write that logic. So it is going to be a public method, and it is going to return the order which it updated in the database, and the name of the method is going to be update order. It is also going to accept the order from the user. So this is going to accept the order. Let's name this as order. All right. So once I get the order, I'm going to extract the ID, and I'm going to fetch that thing from the database. So let's try to write that logic to fetch the order from database. I'm going to use order repository dot find by ID. So find by ID helps us fetch the order from database. Not find all by ID, it's find by ID. So I'm going to take ID of the order that we received from the UI, get ID, and this will give me the order. So I'm going to use the same thing, as it is going to return me optional. I'm going to use or else, and then I'm going to take null, and this will give me the order from DB. Order from DB. So this is the reference to order from the database. Once I got this reference, what I am going to do, I'm going to check if order from DB is null. If order from DB is null, that means there is no order present into DB with that identifier. So I'm going to check if it is equal to null. In that case, what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw new runtime exception. Throw new runtime exception, and I'm going to provide a message. No such order exists. So what we did here, we just checked our database. We try to fetch the order from the database using the specified order ID. If it is not present, then we are throwing no such order exists. Otherwise, if order from database is not null, in that case, what we are going to do? In that case, we are going to update the order. Let's try to update the order. How to do that? So order from DB dot set customer name. I'm going to set the customer name that is coming from the UI. So order dot get customer name. Similarly, the next thing I'm going to do is order from DB. I'm going to set the amount. Dot set the amount. And what amount I'm going to set? Order dot get the amount that we are getting from the UI. Once we do all this step, then we are finally going to save the order into the repository or update the order into the repository. For that, what we are going to do, order repository dot, there is save method. So if it has ID, it updates. If it doesn't have ID, it creates. So let's try to do order from DB. All right, and we have to return this. Why have to return this? Because we are returning the updated order to the client. We wrote this method. Let's try to override this method. As we don't have this in interface, it will ask us to add this method to the interface. So when I go here, I'll press F2 and I'll create that method in my interface. Now my service interface has this method which accepts an order, updates in the DB and returns back the updated order. All right, so we have the method in our service. Now let's write the equivalent method into my controller. So to write the method in my controller, I've come to my controller class and I'll try to write that method. So let's come to the controller class. Yeah, and let's try to write the update method. So what is the method type for update? For updating, we have method type as put. So we'll go here. I'm going to write a public method. Okay, and this is going to return an order that we just updated, and the name of this method is update order. And what it is going to accept, this is going to accept order from the user. So it will be all the values that we want to update in our DB. So order and order. All right, we got this. What is the next step? The next step is to call the method from our service and update the order. Let's try to call order service dot update order and pass the order that we got from the UI. Okay, and then I'm going to take this into a reference order, and I'm going to take this into a reference known as saved order or updated order, and I'm going to save, I'm going to send this back to the client. So let's send it back to the client, updated order. All right. And now what type of mapping do we need here? We need put mapping, because to update something into the database, we use put mapping. Or let's add put mapping. And what should be the path? By default, there is no path, because when we say put mapping, it is known that we have to update the order. We have to add one more annotation known as response body, because we want to convert our order to JSON. And we have to add one more thing, which is known as request body. So let's try to add a request body. So whatever JSON we are going to pass from the postman will be bind to my order. So that is the reason we add request body. Now we have update order ready. Let's try to go here and try to update the order. So the value for amount is 500. We have to update it to 1000. So let's go and see the order info. I'll see the order info, the amount is 500 and I want to update this amount to 1000. So let me start the application. Okay, so while the application is starting, I'll check the logic for my update order service. So I'll go to update order service and I'm doing everything right. Okay, so we are ready. Let's try to see if this works. Let the application start. It is starting out. My machine is a bit slow. I'm using older machine. I don't have Mac, so it is taking a bit of time. Yeah, so application is starting. Yeah, the application started in 26 seconds. I'll go ahead and try to update this. When I try to send this request, so 102 Tawfiq, and it got updated to 1000. So if I see this in order info, you see order info is updated to 1000. I'll make it 1500. So let's go and make this 1500. So I have made this 1500. Let's see if it is updated in the database. Yeah, it updated 1500 into the database. Now let's go and see if our get API is working fine with this. I'll do send, and it is giving Tawfiq and 1500. So we just saved the value, and we get the value, and we updated the value. Now the last operation that is remaining is deleting the value. Deleting the value is where we are deleting the order from our database. Let's try to implement that thing. Again, we will revisit this. For deleting, method is already present in repository. We are going to write the delete logic in service, and we are going to write the delete logic in controller. So let's try to write delete logic in service. Okay. For writing the logic into the service, I'm going to use something called as delete order method. So let's try to write that logic. Yeah. So I'll go to my order service. I'll stop my application, because when I make changes, the changes are not reloaded. I have to restart it again. This is going to be my public method, and it is going to return a string just saying deleted or removed. So, and the name is going to be delete order. This is going to accept the identifier of the order that we want to delete. So integer ID. All right. So that's it. And now we have to use order repository to delete the order. Order repository dot delete by ID. Delete by ID, and we have to pass the ID. And that's it. And finally, we need to return deleted. So deleted is the string that we are returning. Now we'll try to override this, and as it is not present in my interface, it will give an error. And as we do, we have to implement the same thing into the interface, delete order. All right, so now we have delete order functionality present in our service. We have to write the equivalent method for delete order into my controller. So let's try to write the method into the controller. I'll go to my, I'll save this in order service, and I'll go to my controller class, and I'll try to write my delete order here. So every method is going to be a public method in the controller. It is going to return a string if the order is deleted or not. And then I'm going to write a method delete order. It is again going to accept a path variable. So at the rate path variable is a variable that we pass in the URI, and we are going to pass integer variable. So integer ID. And we are going to call the method that we just wrote in the service. So order service dot delete order and the identifier of the order. We are going to return itself this. For this, what mapping are we going to use? So for deleting, we use delete mapping, and it accepts path variable. So we have to use path, and we have to give the name of the variable. So the name of the variable is what? The name of the variable is ID, and this ID has to be same as this name. Both are ID. So now this is fine. We are missing one thing, which is response body. So response body is must whenever you want to pass JSON back to the user. So now we are ready with the delete operation. Now let's try to see if this works. I'm going to go to my Postman. I'm going to go to my delete, and I'm going to call 102, and I'm going to send. When I did send, it gave me what? It gave me nothing because my server is off. So let me start the server. I'll start the server. And starting server takes time. Meanwhile, we'll check in the database if the order is still present. So when I hit it, I see 102, 1500, and Tawfiq is present in my database. My server, let the server start. The server is starting. Yeah, so for deleting, we need to return 200. We need to delete the order and return 200. So server is starting out. Yeah, so order management app, is it ready? Yeah, it's ready. 8080, it's working on 8080. Now I'll go here and I'll try to delete it. When I delete the order, I get the message deleted. It is 200. Okay. Now I should be able to check my database via the query and see if the order is deleted. And you can see the order is completely deleted from my database. So in this video, we saw how to save an order, how to get an order, how to update an order, and how to delete an order using Postman, Spring Boot application, and PostgreSQL. Uh, if you like my content, subscribe to my channel, and thank you guys for watching.